Hi crafty peeps, it's Kat. Welcome to the start of the botanical card series on this channel. To kick this series off, we have one of my favorite flowers of all time, iris. Y'all, I'll be honest, today's cards were a labor of love, but I'll be damned if they're not some of the most beautiful cards I've seen in a hot minute. One thing in this world that I love just as much as cats is the floral dyes that create stunning paper flowers. So I have 5 cards for you today featuring some very bold and unusual color choices, so stick around until the end to see them all. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next botanical cards episode. Let's take a look real quick at the supplies. I got Honeybee Iris die set and a vase die from Pretty Pink Posh to go with it. We'll be doing some minimal alcohol marker coloring and a lot of inking, so I have a bunch of inks in purples, oranges, pinks, and teals. And of course some colored cardstock, and a good portion of it is actually scraps. All of the supplies will be linked in the description. Oh, and we will also need some acetate for the vase. I started out by doing all of my die cutting. I cut one of the flowers from purple cardstock and one from plain white because I want to show you how to do the inking on both. I also cut multiple stems and leaves and a ton of the vase frames. The vase die is meant to be used for shakers, so it's a set of 2 silhouette dies. The larger one cuts out the largest shape with the stitching, the smaller one cuts out a plain small vase, and when you combine them, you get the thin frame piece. I taped the 2 dies together and ran them through a bunch of times to get a total of 8 frames. Spoiler alert, I changed my mind for the second card and ended up not using all of them. I also cut 2 vases from acetate using the largest die, and I trimmed the edges just a tiny bit smaller with my scissors. That's just to make it fit better behind the frame. It'll make sense later on. Before we start, I want to share a little hack with you. When you have complicated layering dies like this one, cut all of the parts from different scraps of colored cardstock, glue them together, and label them with a pen. I downloaded the layering guide from Honeybee's website and followed the labeling convention that they had. So T1 is layer 1, T2 is layer 2, and so forth. What this gives you is an ability to see which parts are going to be visible and which parts are going to be covered. And when you're inking your die cuts, you can easily see which pieces you need to ink and which pieces you can skip. And you can keep this funky piece in the packaging with your dies so you can keep referring back to it again and again. Okay, on to the inking. We will have a ton of it today. First, I'm doing my vases, and I'm inking all 4 of them because I don't want white edges around my die cuts. If that kind of stuff doesn't bother you, you can absolutely skip this. I'm not concerned with how even my inking is on 3 out of the 4 of my pieces. I'm not taking much time or effort on those. But the one that will be on the very top, I do care about. So for that one, I will make sure that the inking is as even as possible. And here I'm doing the same thing in purple ink for the second vase. Again, I only really care about the piece that will be on the very top of my stack. I will also ink my stems and leaves to get some definition and color variation. Starting out with a colored cardstock definitely makes your life easier, I think, because you only really need a darker ink color to get the shading, and you're basically doing half the work. For these guys, I focus my inking mostly on the bottom of the pieces. Now on to the main event. You see I have the funky cheat sheet quote-unquote die cut at the top of my mat, and this is what I will refer to during the process. I really only want to focus on the parts that will be visible when I put it all together. I got a tiny brush here. This is a cheap eyeshadow brush off Amazon. It'll be in the description box. It actually works really well when you need to do any kind of a detailed job. I'm just going in with my lightest color out of my 2 purples, and this is Wilted Violet Distress ink. So I load up my brush and I'm inking the first layer only in the places that will not be covered, which is for this particular one is kind of in the middle. I will, however, leave the very middle uninks so that my color cardstock that's peeking through will serve as a highlight. I also went around the very edge of the die cut so that when it's all stacked, my edges will all be uniform in color. Here, I kind of spaced because the top of the flower will be different in color from the bottom, so I really didn't need to go over the edge with purple ink. I skipped doing this on layer 3 and 4 once I realized my oversight. Then I'll move on to my second layer, and on this one, the 2 petals that are sticking up are the parts that will be showing, so I will pay more attention to how I color those. I'm going around the edges of those petals here, but again, leaving the very middle uninked so that I have that light highlight in the center. And periodically, I'll bring in the piece that layers on top and see how my ink is showing up. The portion that I'm inking right now is what you see showing on that funky die cut in yellow color at the top of my mat. On the third layer, only the petals pointing down will be visible, and those will be a different color, so I'm skipping those for now. You see that portion that will be showing in gray on the funky die cut. I don't plan on gluing the 2 thin petals at the top, so I will ink them too because they'll ultimately be visible. Same thing on layer number 4. I'll only ink the very top petals. Now I'm moving on to my darker purple. This is Villainous Potion Distress ink, and I'll go and repeat exactly what I did with my lighter purple, but I will leave some of that first purple color showing through. I'm basically gradually darkening the edges of my petals all around. While I'm inking away, here's a piece of random trivia for you. In ancient Greece, the goddess Iris served as a messenger between heaven and earth, and purple irises were usually planted on women's graves to summon her to guide them to the afterlife. The flower itself symbolizes wisdom, hope, trust, and valor. I personally find this flower very cool looking because of its unusual shape and vivid colors. And speaking of color, the iris I'm trying to replicate here is called Ozark Rebounder Bearded Iris. Y'all, it's stunning. You don't really see such dark colors in flowers usually, and this one looks super dramatic, which is why I was so drawn to it. I love how the top and the bottom are different colors, and that's kind of what I'm going for with this guy here. The top portion will be dark purple, and the bottom portion will be this dark inky blue, almost black color. Okay, I'm moving on to my blues here, and I will ink the bottom portion of the flower in the same way I did the top. First apply the lighter of my blues around the edges, but leave the center without ink. This lighter shade is Sapphire from Pink Fresh. Then I'll go in with a darker blue, which is Stargazer from Pink Fresh too. It's seriously the most gorgeous shade of dark, deep blue. I use this color a lot. This is what it looks like after the first layer of that lighter blue. My fifth and final petal is that small piece at the bottom center of my mat. This will be the most prominent of them all because it won't be covered up by any of the other pieces, so I will dedicate a little more effort to it. I'll make sure that everything is nicely blended and that there are no harsh transitions. Here I've started going over my first layer with the darker Stargazer shade of blue. Again, the point here is to gradually darken the edges. I think you're starting to get the idea here, so let's skip ahead just a little bit. I'm bringing out the secret ingredient here, the black pigment ink. I know, it sounds a little crazy to use black ink on flowers, but as Russians say, those who don't risk don't get to drink the champagne. So trust the process here, guys. I'm gonna use that black ink to darken the edges even further, and this is what will make that highlight in the middle really pop. Now, to be fair, I'm using a very light hand here and just barely swiping my brush on the very edges of my petals. Look how the center of that fifth petal pops now. If you've never used black ink on your flowers and you want to create some level 10 drama, seriously give it a go. Here's a preview for y'all. I haven't glued anything together yet, I'm just showing you here what it will look like once it's assembled. I think I did pretty darn well compared to my inspiration picture. What do you guys think? I do want to show you how I inked the pieces I cut from plain white cardstock, but I also don't want this video to be 5 hours long, and you've already seen in detail how I did my Ozark iris, so I'll condense this portion considerably. My second iris is called Dark Before Dawn, and it looks like this. Again, different top and bottom colors. So to create it, I'm using 3 orange and 2 pink shades. First, I'm going in with my lightest peachy shade over the top portions of my flower. And then I'll add my medium shade of orange to the petals the same way I did on the purple flower, just gradually darkening the edges all around while leaving the center light. Then I'll repeat the process again with my darkest shade of orange, and the only thing that I did differently here is I dragged that orange ink down the center of my fifth petal to mimic what my reference picture had. Next, I did the bottom portion of the flower with the lighter shade of pink first. Here I did not leave the middle completely white. I just very gently brushed some ink over so that the center is a very light pink and not white. This way the transition doesn't look as harsh. And for the final step, I went over the edges with the darkest shade of pink I had in my stash. I did not use black ink on this flower at all. And here's a little preview for you. I think I did pretty well on this one too. Okay, we're done with the flowers. Now let's move on to the vases we're gonna put those flowers in. I'm coloring the backside of my acetate here with alcohol markers to imitate water in a clear vase. You will never get a streak-free coverage with this method, but that's kind of the point because water reflects light in all the different directions and the streaks kind of mimic that look. So I first laid down the lighter shade of blue out of the two and then went over it in kind of a swiping side-to-side motion with the darker shade of the marker. Next, I stacked 2 of my vase die cuts together and glued my acetate to the front of them. I put the glue everywhere except for the top portion of the die cut. I then went in with my scissors and snipped away a portion in the top middle. You can see that vase drying under the acrylic block. This opening will allow us to easily slide in our flower when we glue the vase to the card front. My remaining 2 vase die cuts I glued together, making sure that the piece with the pretty inking was on top, but it really didn't matter in the end because I ended up covering it. The front stack of die cuts I left intact. I didn't cut any of the pieces out. While that whole vase situation is drying under the block, I'm assembling my first flower. I'm gluing most of the bottom portion of the flower without popping anything up. That section will end up being like 4 or 5 layers thick in total, so there will be plenty of dimension. But my petals I'm popping up using black foam squares. Because my flower is pretty dark, I don't want any white foam squares showing from the side, and the black ones are gonna be way less visible. Then I'll set the flower to dry under the block and we'll finish assembling the vase. I'm just gluing my top stack of die cuts on top of the piece with the cutout in the middle, and that will just cover that cutout nicely and no one will know it's there. Unless, of course, they go looking. But it will allow me to slide my flower in and out to get the position just right on the card front. Now the flower is dry and look at it. I would say quite the unusual color combo for a floral, but I'll be damned if it's anything but gorgeous. And all that extra dimension on the petals, just chef's kiss. My stem wasn't long enough for the vase, so to make it longer, I took another stem that the set cuts, the one that doesn't have the leaves, and I cut off the head off of it and trimmed it down just a bit. Then I glued it behind my main stem, kind of extending it in that way. And to hide the seam where the two die cuts meet, I glued a leaf on top. And I cut that leaf down a bit so that it doesn't look too similar to the one above it. That one above I glued behind my main stem, by the way. You don't need to do this, you can use the stem as is. I just wanted my stem to more or less reach the bottom of the vase. I thought it looked better that way. I wanted the card base to be something other than a square or a rectangle, so I went with ovals instead. It's fun to switch things up every once in a while. And these are the Spellbinders modern ovals, and they're longer and larger than your typical A2 ovals. The largest die cuts a shape that's 3.35 by 5.5, so I needed my panels to be cut to about 3.5 or 4 by 6 to be able to cut it out. In any case, I cut a bunch of ovals for my card bases using that largest die. My front and my back are going to be 2 layers thick each. That's just to make the card sturdier. But I will have one white oval for the front and 2 white ovals for the back. My second layer on the front will be actually my textured panel, so the actual card front. You just saw me score my first panel about 1/2 inch from the top. This will be a top folding card. So I made a hinge of sorts and reinforced the fold. Then I will put the glue only above that score line and will glue the second oval on top. Through some trial and error, I came to realize that the easiest way to make this reinforced type of card base is to actually glue two pieces together first, then score it, then glue the front on. It just gives you a much better fold line and the card opens up easier. For my front oval panel, I wanted some texture and interest, so I used the cover plate die with the stitching pattern. I got this one off Amazon, it's by Ellen Hudson, and I haven't come across this brand before, but the die seems to be really nice quality. If you used this brand before, guys, do let me know in the comments what you think of it. So I taped my front panel to the cover plate and ran it through the die cutting machine. If you don't have anything similar, you can do an embossing folder. Just be mindful of having too much texture because it can be hard to glue things down then. This die doesn't make cuts per se, just pierces and creates texture, and I have to say it's really darn cute. I then glued my pink panel to the front of my card base, lined it all up from the inside so that nothing sticks out, and set my acrylic block and my wax seal case on top until it dried. My card doesn't really want to stand on display neatly because it's an oval with a rounded edge. It kind of wobbles, so to help it out, I trimmed off just a tiny little bit off the bottom back of my card base, just a tiny bit. This will create enough of support to help it stand up. Okay, it's time to start assembling this card. I've put the glue on the back of the vase and I'll glue it down on the very bottom of the panel, literally going as low as I can without getting out of bounds here. Once it's adhered, I'll slide in my stem. Because we snipped away that piece out of the bottom layer on the vase, the stem slides in and out pretty easily, so I have plenty of room here to get the positioning just right. I will then bring in my iris and check the fit, and yes, I am leaving the flower hanging off the edge of the card. The card itself will fit into an A6 envelope with no issues. And once I know that I got my placement right, I'll glue down the stem. I'm not gonna bother taking it out of the vase, it's contained and not going anywhere. I will just glue the top portion down. Then I will glue down the actual flower, and I'm not using any foam or anything. I think there's plenty of dimension here already. I will just glue it straight down, and I'm only putting the glue on the bottom portion of the flower, the part that will be touching the card base. And this is where I decided to change things up a bit. As I was looking at the nearly completed card, I don't know, things just felt off. I thought that this bright purple vase was kind of fighting with the flower for attention, and I also felt like my attempt at water wasn't watery enough for me. Like, it wasn't the look that I was going for. So, I did a couple of things. For my second card, I was going to use a super dark background, so my light blue on acetate wasn't going to show up well anyways. So instead, I thought, why not use it on the lighter card? And actually, when you layer that second acetate piece on top, it really makes a difference. It does make water look more like water. It's kind of hard to explain, but it feels like there's more depth to it. So I cut another vase frame and inked it way darker than what I have on the card now. And I glued my second piece of acetate to that darker frame. It takes a hot minute for the glue to dry on acetate, so while that's adhering under my block over here, I will work on my sentiment. I usually stack my sentiments, so what you just saw was me making tick marks on what will be the backing of my sentiment. These are just the pieces that did not come out well and have some sort of defect. I don't toss them, I use them to stack things. First, I figured out the placement where I wanted my sentiment to go. Then I marked with a pencil where the sentiment overlaps the vase and then cut at those spots. It turned out to be 2 inches exactly, so the rest of my pieces I just chopped down to 2 inches straight away. Then I glued all of my short pieces together. This is all just to make sure that my sentiment will sit flush with the vase. It will make more sense in just a little bit. Once the glue dried on the vase piece, I'll go ahead and add that right on top of the vase that I have on the card. And you can see here that I inked that new piece with much darker purple, and I also created some shading on one side for a more dimensional look. I feel like that bright purple was just too bright, so I toned it down. I'm gonna stretch my sentiment across the vase, and those backings that I glued together will help it sit level and not sag. So I'm gonna glue them in place first and then glue the actual sentiment on top. And here's the first card done. Having learned from the purple vase on the first card, I abandoned the pink vase that you saw me ink up in the beginning of the video. I'm going with a dark blue vase instead. I cut it out of the colored cardstock and inked the edges mostly just on the right to create some shading. And I also want to create some texture, but I wanted to be more on the subtle side. So I brought out a background stamp that coincidentally also has irises on it. I lined it up in my MISTI so that I get a certain portion of the pattern that I want, and I stamped the image with the same darkest shade of blue that I used on my first iris. It's that stargazer shade. This will create visual texture, but it will be subtle and won't be clashing with my flower or taking attention away from it. I actually want that bright orange and pink iris to be the only thing that stands out and pops on my card, so I'm keeping my background and the vase pretty dark. I stamped the image several times here to get a good impression. Guys, look at this thing. Isn't it gorgeous? This reminds me a bit of chinoiserie vases. I think it's stunning. I've already assembled my second card base here the same way I did the first one. And here's a little hack for you. If you're concerned about your card fitting into the envelope when you let things hang off the edge, use that envelope as a guide. I have a wide A6 envelope underneath my card base, and as long as I don't go outside of the confines of that envelope, it will all fit nicely. I'm gonna pop my vase up using some black foam squares since my background is dark. I need that extra space to be able to slide in my flower. I'll put some glue on the foam squares for the extra wiggle room and will attach it to my base at the very bottom, just like with the first card. I ended up not using the original stem I cut from the colored cardstock. Instead, I cut out another flower stem off camera from plain white, and I inked it using a teal green ink that was lighter than that original teal cardstock I had. This is all because I wanted to make the flower pop, and to achieve that, I had to go lighter because my background is so dark. And I played around with the layout until I knew what should go where, and once I was happy, I glued everything down. For the sentiment, I picked a foiled strip. This is gold foil on black cardstock, and I trimmed it down just a tad so that it would fit within the vase borders. And then I glued it down without stacking it or popping it up. That's actually a first for me. Usually always stack my sentiments at least 2 layers. Now, let's look at all of the cards I made. This is the very first one. You know, it's a really pretty die set, so what usually happens with those is I get obsessed and, well, next thing you know, I have a ton of cards. This is the second one. I'm absolutely in love with that vase, y'all. I think it's gorgeous. I kept my background and my vase very dark and my iris light and bright, and because of contrast, your eye is automatically drawn to the flower, which is exactly what I wanted. Next, I have a much lighter and brighter version with blue and yellow. This is side folding, and to get that, all you have to do is get a folded card base and tape your die to it so that one cutting edge hangs off the fold line and doesn't cut it. I didn't blend the two colors pretty much at all so that I don't get green in the middle, but I got them as close as possible to each other without actually blending. This is another variation of the pink flower. Here I stamped the background with a scripty font and darkened the edges to draw the eye into the center. I cut the vase from black and embossed it in an embossing folder, and I think it came out really cool. For the sentiment, I used another foil strip and trimmed it down to fit better across the vase. And last but not least, I have an actual traditional card base, but this one is A6 size, which is 4.5 by 6.25. I got a smaller oval from orange cardstock, embossed it with a folder, and then brayered on some darker orange ink to create some texture. I then cut a black mat with that largest oval and glued it behind. And for the vase, I used a press plate to make an impression in my Better Press system. Let me know in the comments which one is your favorite. Don't forget to subscribe and follow me on Instagram. Catch you guys in the next video.